Hey guys, this is Landon Blake with Redefined Horizons, and this is our webinar, CLSA webinar for February 27th, I think. Nope, 28th, sorry, Friday, February 28th, 2025. I'm pre-recording this for you guys. In this webinar, we're going to talk about an IBLA decision. It's a relatively short decision. And looks like there ended up being a settlement, but it's kind of an interesting story, and it touches on some survey and land title legal principles, so I thought it would be a fun case to talk about. It's an IBLA case, Interior Board of Land Appeals. As far as I can tell, it never went to the federal courts. It looks like it settled after the IBLA decision, but it's an interesting IBLA decision, and it's fairly short, so it's only, I think it's 16 pages. Yeah, 16 pages. I've got the case pulled up there on my screen. You can probably see. So I thought it'd be a fun one to talk about, and it's pretty recent. So this was decided in 2005. That the dispute arose in the late 90s, but it was decided in 2005. And it has to do, the dispute centers around an island in the Missouri River in between Nebraska and South Dakota. So I'll let you know just a couple little quick housekeeping things here at the top. So I don't represent CLSA in an official capacity today when I'm teaching the webinar, so I don't think I'm going to say anything super crazy, or controversial, but the opinions expressed herein are my own. And you're welcome to reach out to me if you have questions or comments. In fact, I think one of the land surveyors that worked for the BLM on this survey of Goat Island, I think I got an email from him, so I'm going to try and follow up with him, and be interesting to hear a little bit more of this story. So that was super cool. It's a recent case, so I was able to hear from the actual surveyor that was on the ground, I think. So anyways, you're welcome to reach out to me if you have feedback on this, but please don't send me hate mail. I already have depression, and hate mail is not good for me, so don't send me hate mail. And then the other thing is, if you would like to teach a webinar or co-present a webinar, or you have a topic you would like to hear, please let me know. I try and do these monthly, and believe it or not, I occasionally run out of things to talk about. So I have to think about. Sometimes I struggle to come up with webinar topics. So which is really surprising because I love to talk. So if you have something that you'd like to hear about or that you want to teach about, please reach out to me, or you can reach out to Kelly at Central Office, CLSA Central Office, and let us know. All right, let's jump into this case. I don't think this will be a super long webinar. I'm hoping I can keep it to 30 minutes, I think. So as I mentioned, this is a dispute about Goat Island in the Missouri River. I actually found a pretty good picture of it. So if you can see my screen, this is Goat Island here. And this is the Missouri River. So you can kind of tell that it's you can see that the Missouri River here, it looks like it's fairly ambulatory, right? So it's shallow and sandy, and it looks like it's a kind of what they call a braided channel. And the island is actually pretty big. It's a little bit deceptive in this photo, but the case said it's at low water, at its widest point, it's a half a mile wide almost, and it's almost 3 miles long. So I don't know what the water level is in this picture. I think it's fairly high water level. I imagine when the water level drops a little bit, this channel dries up here and this extends. But you can kind of tell in the picture here, this is like the lower kind of sandy part of the island that probably floods fairly often, but you can see there's some pretty mature timber here on this higher part of the island here. And in the case, it says at its tallest point right here, it's I think they said 15 to 20 feet above the low water mark. So that's substantial. This part of the island is certainly substantial, and like I said, I think when the river dries, the island extends across this channel. It's not clear to me. I don't think this area here is part of the island, but it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell from the photo. So that's Goat Island. That's the island that's at dispute in the case here. All right, guys, I actually got a little better view of this. So here's Goat Island. So you can see, where is this? All right, so it's right here on the boundary between South Dakota and Nevada. And I think that picture we were just looking at is actually looking to the west, and I think we're just seeing a small little piece right here of this. So you can see it's actually it's a fairly large island. So this is pretty substantial. Pretty substantial feature. Yeah, I wish I could tell a little better from that aerial view. Maybe this is part of Goat Island here, this area here. And this is the other channel in the river, so maybe this is part of it. I can't tell. You know what? I think it's possible that this little channel right here is this little channel right here. And so what's in the foreground of the photo there is this area here, maybe. I don't know, it's hard to tell. Anyways, it's a big island. It's big. It's not small. Okay, so what happened here? I don't know what happened. But somehow everybody loses this island for 100 years, which is crazy to me. So at some time in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, some folks from, I think it's Nebraska, I think it's Cedar County in Nebraska, some people in Nebraska find this island. And I don't know what that means. I don't. They find it. And some folks from the county reach out to the BLM about taking ownership of the island. And the BLM goes in and looks at that. And it's a little hard to tell. I'm reading between the lines a little bit on some of the IBLE decision, but it looks like what happens is the county approaches the BLM. The BLM takes a look at this, and what happens is the BLM goes in and they look at the GLO survey records. And there's 2 or 3 GLO surveys here. So there's kind of one on the north side of the river. There's one on the south side of the river, and then I think there might be another survey that was done of just like the river meanders. It's a little hard to tell from the case. And none of those original GLO surveys actually show Goat Island, which is kind of crazy, but they don't show it. And so the BLM looks at that and they say, hey, we don't think Goat Island existed when the GLO surveys were done. Now that's important. So let me just stop here and explain why this is important. So the key question that is at issue here, the key legal question is, was Goat Island an actual island at the time of statehood? Because if it was an island when South Dakota and Nebraska became states, then it is unsurveyed federal land and the feds own it. If Goat Island was not an island, if it emerged after statehood, I mean, it's obviously an island now. If it wasn't an island at statehood and it emerged after statehood, then the states own it. Either Nebraska owns it or South Dakota owns it, or they share some ownership. And so that's the key question. and I'm not 100% sure exactly how the rules work. I would need to do a little more research, but essentially a sandbar doesn't count. So it had to have been an actual what they call dry land or fast land at statehood, which means there had to be some timber on it. It couldn't have been just a low-lying sandbar. You can see as you look at this is probably a sandbar here, right? So this wouldn't count. And I imagine these features change every year after high water. Some of these sandbars look a little different. This does not look like a sandbar, obviously. So that's the key question, the key legal question. So the BLM looks at this and they say, hey, this island wasn't in the original surveys. We don't think it existed at statehood. So they told Cedar County, go figure this out. It's not a federal issue. We don't think it's unclaimed federal land, and we can't give it to you. All right. Well, at some point, I'm not sure exactly what happens, but folks at the National Park Service find out about this, and they freak out, and they say, "Hey, that's federal land, and it's part of the." I can't remember the name of the. The Park Service says, "Hey, that's unsurveyed federal land, and it should be part of the Missouri National Recreational River. The counties can't have it." And there was a private party at some point, a private citizen that came in and wanted to try and claim this land. So there's a number of people trying to make claims to the land. But the Park Service is just essentially, National Park Service goes back to the BLM and says, hey, you need to take another look at this. We think this is federal land. And so the BLM does. They go back in and they take another look. And to be fair to the Park Service hires a consultant, and he goes out and he dates some trees and he digs up some historical maps. And so the Park Service gives that information to the BLM and they tell the BLM, hey, we think this is federal land. And you need to reconsider your decision. So the BLM does that. So the BLM goes in, they look at the information from the Park Service, they go and they visit the island, and they do a survey. They do a survey of the island under a set of special instructions. And they change their mind. They say, oh, we were wrong. This is unsurveyed federal land, and it belongs to the federal government, and the Park Service is going to take it. Now, I'm not sure why it's not clear from the case, but Nebraska is okay with that decision. And I think the reason why is because the BLM says that Goat Island is on the Nebraska side of the state line. So you can kind of see where Google has the state boundary drawn. And that's basically where the BLM puts the line between the states on their survey. And so that puts Goat Island on the Nebraska side. And so South Dakota, I don't know if that's what got South Dakota fired up or if there was another issue, but South Dakota is not happy. They're like, hey, Goat Island is not unsurveyed federal land, and the boundary between the two states runs along the South Channel, not the North Channel. Goat Island belongs to us. And so they basically challenge the BLM survey of Goat Island. They challenge that at the Interior Board of Land Appeals. So now we have a couple, there's two or three kind of related legal questions now that are before the Interior Board of Land Appeals. So there's the main legal question, which is, did Goat Island exist as, an island, not a sandbar, at the time of statehood? That's the first question. The second question is, did BLM follow the proper procedures when they identified this land as unsurveyed, and when they conducted a survey of it, did they follow the proper federal procedures, the Code of Federal Regulations? And then the third question is, did BLM properly locate the boundary between the two states in this area? So South Dakota's argument is, no, Goat Island was not an island at the time of statehood. No, BLM did not follow proper procedure. And no, BLM did not properly locate the boundary between the states in this area. And the BLM basically says the opposite. All right, so what did the IBLA determine? Okay, so before I give you that answer, I know I'm going to disappoint you here. So the IBLA doesn't actually make a decision about Goat Island. And that's because the actual legal issue that IBLA needed to decide was, did South Dakota have the right, let me rephrase that, did the BLM have an obligation to refer their decision to survey Goat Island to an administrative law judge for review? That was the actual technical legal issue. So the BLM makes a decision. They say Goat Island is unsurveyed federal land. We're going to survey it. South Dakota says, no, you're wrong. And the actual legal question before the IBLA is, should the BLM have referred that decision to an administrative law judge when South Dakota protested the survey, when they protested the decision? And the short answer to that very specific technical legal question is no, South Dakota did not, or the BLM did not have an obligation to refer that to an administrative law judge. So in that sense, the BLM won this case. But it's like a lot of things related to the law. It's more nuanced than that. It's more complicated than that. What the IBLA says is the BLM did not have an obligation to refer this to an administrative law judge when South Dakota protested the survey. Sorry, that's my 7 a.m. siren in Oakdale. But the IBLA says we have the discretion to refer it to an administrative law judge, and we don't agree with the BLM that this is cut and dry. We think there's a lot of ambiguity here, and it absolutely should be reviewed in a legal proceeding before an administrative law judge. So the BLM won on the narrow legal question, but they kind of lost in the broader sense because the IBLA said, yeah, BLM, we think South Dakota's made some good arguments here and they deserve a hearing before a law judge. But that on the actual issue of the BLM, was the BLM obligated to do that? No. The IBLA said BLM doesn't have to do that according to federal law, but we can, and we are. And so they send it back to an administrative law judge. And South Dakota said, hey, look, we disagree with the BLM's decision here, and we need an opportunity to, examine their evidence and cross-examine their experts and do all the things that we would get to do in a trial before an administrative law judge. And the BLM says, yeah, we think you're right. We think you should be able to do all those things. And so that was, in essence, what's in the 16-page decision. But there is some discussion of those other legal questions, even though we don't get definitive answers out of the IBLA. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. So what you learn in the decision is that, in essence, if Goat Island was an island at the time of statehood, well, then it's unsurveyed federal land. And the IBLA decision makes clear that the BLM gets to decide what is unsurveyed land and what isn't, and they get to decide when to survey unsurveyed land. So they have the authority under federal law to make those two decisions. Part of what I learned from this case is those decisions have consequences. So if the BLM shows up and decides your favorite swimming hole is unsurveyed federal land, and they're going to survey it, that has some consequences, from a land title perspective. Once the BLM decides it's unsurveyed federal land and they survey it, it can then be disposed of or transferred to a federal agency. So those decisions have consequences. And the IBLA says, yeah, the BLM has the authority to do that under federal law. Now, you can challenge those decisions. If you're a private party or a state or a county or a city, you can challenge those decisions, but the BLM has the authority to make those under law. So those two things, they can decide what is and what isn't unsurveyed federal land. And if they decide that something is unsurveyed federal land, they have the right to survey it. They have the authority to determine that it needs to be surveyed and to execute the survey.
So it's kind of interesting that the BLM has those powers. Okay, so that was one thing the IBLA explains in the decision. The other thing that they explain in the decision is, hey, the BLM doesn't get to draw boundaries between the states. They said that's the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court gets to do that. So they said, they basically told South Dakota, don't hyperventilate. The BLM doesn't get to determine the boundary between South Dakota and Nebraska. It may have showed up in some of the survey documents. They may have drawn a dotted line and labeled it that way, but it doesn't really mean anything. And to be fair to South Dakota, I don't think that's, based on my experience as an expert witness, I think it's dangerous to let things like that go into the record without protesting. And so I think South Dakota was right to protest that. I think the IBLA is correct. The BLM doesn't, based on what I read, the BLM doesn't have the authority to draw the state boundaries. But you shouldn't let the BLM put a line on a map and label it if you don't agree with the line either. I think you should protest that and get that in the record. And so I think South Dakota was smart to do that. But the IBLA basically agrees with South Dakota and says, yeah, we're not going to tell you where the boundary goes. So in other words, the IBLA says, we're not going to tell you if the boundary's here on the North Channel or on the South Channel. But they said, don't worry about it, South Dakota. The BLM doesn't get to decide that. Only the Supreme Court gets to decide that. Let's see, what was the other? There was one more legal issue that we were talking about. I can't remember what it is now. I apologize. I'm sorry. So what I want to do for the last few minutes is just talk briefly about some of the evidence here on both sides, and then we can talk a little bit about what decision I might have made in this situation, or what decision you might have made. So let's talk about the evidence that the BLM presents, and I'm not going to go through them line by line. It's really interesting. You can read the case. I don't know how many maps are mentioned in the case. Somewhere between 8 maps and a dozen, somewhere in there. So the BLM presents several historical maps that all show either a sandbar or an island in this general vicinity, and they go way back. Let me check my notes here. Let's see. They go way back, all the way to before statehood. So they go back to so the first map is in 1796. That's pretty old. 1796 is a pretty old map. By the way, South Dakota and Nebraska become states pretty close together. I think the case said it was within 12 or 15 years of each other they become states. The United States federal government acquired the land that became South Dakota and Nebraska as part of the Louisiana Purchase. So way back, the BLM's got maps that go way back before statehood that show either a sandbar or an island in this general vicinity. They say, hey, we went out, that we've got tree cores that go back to at least 1930. Now that's quite an extensive period, a long time after statehood, but there's trees at least as old as the 1930s on the island. So you got to remember this is 2005. Those trees are almost 100 years old, 80 years old. The BLM says, based on these historic maps and the trees, the information we got from the tree cores, we think Goat Island existed at the time of statehood. Okay, so South Dakota says, hey, nice try. They say all those maps that the BLM submitted into evidence show Goat Island in different places and different shapes. How do we even know that they're talking? They could have been talking about a sandbar. They definitely aren't talking about an island in the same location with the same shape. They said that the island isn't shown on any of the 3 original surveys, GLO surveys. You guys can't be serious here, right? Those maps aren't evidence. And they said, yeah, we're not. The trees only go back to 1930. That's not proof that the island existed and was dry enough to grow timber at statehood. That's only 1930. And there's some back and forth about that. The tree expert says, well, hey, this could have been flooded, or there was some evidence of a fire. There's probably timber on the island before that. And there's just something happened. The trees got scoured by an ice flow, or there was a bad fire or a flood, or all 3. So there's some back and forth on that. And then South Dakota has submits some other historic maps that don't show an island here. And South Dakota makes an interesting claim. They don't talk about it in detail, but they said, hey, we think that Goat Island used to be part of the North Bank. So that they say it was not an island at statehood. What they're saying is that at the time of statehood, the river channel actually went down here to the south, and this north channel had not been cut open yet. And if you look at that, I mean, I kind of can see that. I can kind of see, this. That makes some sense to me that this was the old river channel here. You can almost trace it, right? And in that case, this was part of South Dakota. You can kind of see that kind of matches up with this other timbered area here. Like, yeah, I don't know. I think South Dakota might have a good argument there. So what do you do? I encourage you to read the decision and consider some of the evidence for yourself. And I don't have all the maps. It'd be interesting. I'm going to try and reach out to that BLM surveyor. Maybe he can send me all the documents. It'd be interesting to look at that. I'll be honest with you. Usually when I read an IBLA decision, I'm able to come to an opinion. I couldn't make a decision on this. This would have been a hard decision for me. And then maybe if I'd have seen some of the other maps, I could have made a decision. This is a tough call, man. Like if the IBLA had to make a call on this, or the administrative law judge had to make a call on this, that'd be tough. It'd be really tough. I could go either way. I'm leaning a little bit to that argument, towards that argument that South Dakota made that this was actually Goat Island was actually part of South Dakota. And that this was the north bank of the river. Just based on what I've seen there, that makes some sense to me. But yeah, hard to say. There's some strong evidence that this thing was an island at the time of statehood as well. So it's a tough call. I'm not really sure. What I would do there. Interesting. I'd be interested to hear from some of you guys about what you think on, where you would come down on this issue of if Goat Island was an island at the time of statehood. All right, so I tried to find that decision somewhere in the record, and I couldn't. And I'll tell you why. Here's why I don't think it ever got in the record. So, oh man, I think I lost it. Oh, nope, it's a PDF. Hang on, let me pull up this PDF. So, here's the case, by the way. It's IBLA 166-210. This is the decision. But I did find this on the Associated Press website. It says officials resolved dispute over Goat Island and Missouri River, and it basically says the states and the Park Service came to a settlement agreement, and that National Park Service is going to manage the island as part of the Missouri National Recreational River. Now, I don't know what happened here. I don't know if they decided that this was not worth fighting over or what, but they made some kind of agreement, and the states are going to work together. But essentially, the Park Service, took Goat Island in as part of that National Recreational River area. But yeah, interesting. So this may be why I can't find a decision in the record that the parties ended up making a settlement, which is probably the right move. That probably saved taxpayers, federal taxpayers, and state taxpayers some money. It doesn't look like there's a bridge out here, so you got to get to this by boat. It looks like. But so, anyways, they came to a settlement agreement on this. And I think that's why this decision would, the ultimate decision about whether or not this island existed, statehood, is not in the record. But it's an interesting question. So, what do we learn about this? I think there's some interesting legal concepts in here about federal authority to both identify unsurveyed lands and to survey lands. And it's kind of interesting that act of surveying has some legal weight to it, right? When the BLM decides something needs to be surveyed, that carries some legal weight and it has some consequences to it. It's interesting. If you geek out on the law a little bit, there's some interesting, issues touched on in this decision about, the proper procedures, were the proper procedures followed. I didn't talk about this, but it's mentioned in the case. South Dakota comes in and when they would do their protest at the IBLA, and they say, hey, the BLM's not following the rules here. And it's kind of interesting because it sounds like the BLM kind of does some backtracking a little bit, and they kind of come back and say, "Oh yeah, we were just kidding about that." So I think, and I don't think that was intentional on the part of the folks at the BLM. I think, this interesting question came up. They were being approached by the National Park Service. I think they went out and, they just started doing some things. Maybe they didn't carefully think that all the way through. And then, when South Dakota started to pitch a fit, the BLM had to backtrack a little bit and say, yeah, we didn't really mean that, or it didn't really mean what we said it meant at the time. So they kind of got caught with their pants down a little bit. And I guess one of the lessons there is, if you're walking into a potentially contentious boundary dispute, which we do sometimes as land surveyors, you got to be very careful about what you say, and you got to be very careful about what work products you put out, because people are going to get frothed up and excited and angry and upset. And so you just have to think, you don't want to just be cowboying stuff in that kind of situation. You want to really think about that. And probably in hindsight, the BLM should have been a little bit more careful about how they approached this survey from a procedural perspective. Now, they did notify, the attorney generals and the secretary of state of South Dakota and Nebraska. And I'm not saying they didn't do any outreach or coordination, but it feels like there was a couple things they did that maybe they probably shouldn't have done in hindsight. They drew a line and labeled it as the state boundary, and that got some people fired up. And the BLM was kind of like, we were just making a map. Yeah, but you're the BLM and your maps have legal consequences. I can understand why South Dakota might have been a little worked up. So, maybe the BLM could have approached that a little more carefully. And there's some lessons there for us too, I think, as land surveyors about, what we put on maps matters and it has legal significance. And I think it can impact title to land. And we have to be careful. We have to think about what we're doing. And then there's interesting issues in this decision about what's an island versus what's a sandbar. The timing is important. This is one of those cases that helps you understand that the history of a particular piece of land is really important, because that's going to determine, to a large extent, that determines its legal status and the source of its title. And so the timing here is really critical. When Goat Island became an island is super critical. And, how the river changed its course in this area is important. That could change, that could change whether the Goat Island belongs to Nevada or South Dakota or the feds. And so that it's a case that helps demonstrate that, that the history is important and that the timing of events are important and that they impact title to land. So super good IBLA decision. Interesting. I think the IBLA in this case made a good decision. I don't always say that. About 50% of the time or more, I say I don't like the IBLA decision, or I don't agree with it. I think this was a good decision by the IBLA. One other thing that made this seem a little fishy is, the BLM reached one decision when they took their first look, and then when the Park Service squealed, they reversed that decision and made a decision that favored the Park Service. And I'm not saying that was wrong. I think the BLM. I'm trying to think of how I want to word this. I understand that the BLM sometimes deserves the opportunity to take a second look at the evidence. It just doesn't look good. That didn't look good. That made it look like they were playing fast and loose with the rules to make the Park Service happy. And so again, it's an area where maybe the BLM could have been a little more careful about how they approach things and how they made that initial decision. So yeah, interesting case. Has some lessons for us as land surveyors. So I hope you guys enjoyed hearing about it. Check it out. Read the case. It's not very long. Probably take you 30 minutes to read. 16 pages. I'll try and remember to send Kelly the link to the case along with the video, and we'll try and get that linked. We'll get a link up on the CLSA website. So there you go. Now you know a little bit about the battle for Goat Island. Thanks for listening.